So today, I want to tell you all a story about a camp that I grew up at. And I first want to say that that camp was perfect. That nothing should have ever been changed about that camp because it's a place where I found friendship, I found joy, and I experienced God. And in my mind, that camp could do no wrong and nothing needed to make that camp better. And that was until I was on a summer staff there, and I was the director, and I learned a pretty important lesson. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So our scripture lesson today was from chapter 9, and it was an interesting one. Often we think of our disciples as role models, as people that we should look up to, people who we should aspire to be like. But in this lesson, we saw them bickering. We saw them bickering over who gets to be closest to Jesus or who follows Jesus the best. Now, Jesus wasn't around for this conversation, but he knew what was happening, so his response was to put a child right next to his side. And then he told his disciples, "Whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For the least among all of you is the greatest." Now, this child didn't have the same physical capabilities, cognitive capabilities. The child hadn't been around long enough to even earn his position next to Christ. But that didn't matter, because Christ sees the world through a lens of welcome, inclusion, and equality. So our next scripture that we looked at was in Luke, and it was in chapter 18. And it's a verse that we all know pretty well, at least if you work in youth and children's ministry, because it's where the disciples were sort of gatekeeping or stopping the children from running up to Christ. And they were saying, "No, you should stop here." And Christ says, "No, let the children come to me." See, there's this tendency the disciples have to be gatekeepers, or to filter who gets to be blessed by Jesus or who gets to be close to Jesus. And it's not the only time that we see this. We see this when Jesus went to go feed the 4,000 who were all Gentiles and foreigners. And the disciples grumbled the entire time that was happening. But yet when Jesus fed the 5,000 Jewish people, the disciples did so happily without complaint. See, culturally, this was a time where there was a hierarchy that existed with holiness, and the religious leaders back then were not necessarily accessible to everyone. The disciples may have very well thought that they were honoring who Christ was by gatekeeping or figuring out who deserves time with Christ. But as we can see, the disciples may not have been the most qualified to be gatekeepers for Christ, and that is because Christ is for all of us. Christ requires those who are with him or who travel with him to welcome. Those who are part of Christ's ministry are to welcome the least of these. Those do not have position, or those don't have necessarily a worldly sense of value, and that's because to God, we all have a unique and equal divine value. So in today's world, we might not have the same hierarchical ideas, and important people might not distance themselves in the same way. At church, we have our children's conversation where the kids get to be really close to the pastor or whoever's giving that children's conversation. Just last year, I saw Governor Shapiro at the Broad Street Market having lunch with a bunch of retirees who play chess, and they've been a fixture there for the past 20 or 30 or even 40 years. And even the Pope, he took off the protective screen on the Pope-mobile. And I think this is all to make our leaders more accessible. So the gatekeeping is not nearly as blatant. But there are still subtle barriers that exist. And those barriers may filter the involvement of individuals or groups. These barriers are not necessarily people, but they're structures, traditions, and practices. And this was true for my beloved Camp Raynard. So this camp was supposed to be perfect, and it was pretty great. It had a giant pool in between two even bigger lakes. And I grew up there with many memories of playing chicken or playing water polo. And then I got to be on summer staff. And we realized when I was on summer staff, as a young 19-year-old, that our pool was not necessarily made so that all could enjoy it. We didn't have any lifts, and we didn't have any ramps. And me, as a young 19-year-old, thought, well, why do we need to spend tens of thousands of dollars to install these lifts and install these ramps? We have never had anybody here who has needed them, so why should we spend that money? And it was in that moment that I realized that maybe we haven't had campers who have needed to use them because the construction of our camp did not welcome or allow those campers to fully participate in the community that the camp was created for. See, there are multitudes of people out there who are just waiting to be part of the community, to engage in it. Who knows how many families had come to camp and realized that there were barriers in place, that there were things like lacking in accessibility that kept their campers from fully engaging in everything that that camp had to offer. See, this can be daunting work, but it's also good work for us to try to recognize the things that keep as many people as possible from being a part of the amazing community that camp was. So at church, the hope is that the longer we're here, the more comfortable we are. The better we learn where to enter the building, we learn where to park, we learn where we can sit, where we can either make funny faces at kids or get away from kids making funny faces. For me, I like to make funny faces at kids. We learn that after service, there is a great place to go get some snacks. You know, it's the important things. But as time goes on, what we start to lack is remembering what it was like to first walk into the building, to first realize what those barriers might be that were hard for us, the things that might be obstacles for us, the physical, social, cultural barriers. So if we think long and hard enough, we can all think of a time when we walked into a space, and in that space we realized that we were not the only, or that we were the only ones that didn't know everybody else, that everybody else knew each other. Now, it would be wrong of me to compare, because I'm still pretty new here, it would be wrong of me to compare that time, the first time that I walked into this church, because all of you were lovely, you were warm and welcoming, and I also had the unique advantage of the fact that my coming was announced. But I do remember a time where I visited this famous megachurch in New York City. This was over 10 years ago, and it was called Hillsong Church. And I remember when we were walking on the New York streets, there were these greeters out in front of the church, and they were jumping and yelling and just creating all sorts of noise, and every time somebody walked in through the threshold, they would cheer and yell. So Molly and I walked in, and the same thing happened. They cheered and yelled, and it was almost a little startling, but they were happy that we were there. But then we had no idea how to get to the worship space. So we wandered around a little bit trying to figure out where to go. We eventually found our way and joined a congregation of about 10,000 people. And these 10,000 people, I realized that everybody was my age, and I was in my early 20s at the time. So there were 10,000 people, all my age, all taking part in this worship service that was completely foreign to me. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And the only person I knew was Molly sitting next to me. And it made me realize that the church that I was serving, I actually think I felt more comfortable when a group of retired ladies on a Tuesday afternoon invited me to sit down and fold newsletters with them than at that church. So including people can be a challenging thing. It can be a unique thing. So the good news is that in the text, Jesus is the one that includes and makes available all of the love and grace that comes from God. Even though Jesus comes from a Jewish tradition, the good news of love and grace are offered to the Romans, the Gentiles, and the foreigners. It is offered to the children who are excited just to be near Christ. Even though they don't follow any cultural standard or follow any rules of decorum, Christ says, "Let the children come to me." And the good news is that there is nothing that we need to do to earn this love or grace or acceptance, because it is already offered to us. Christ's grace is for all of God's children, regardless of age, race, nationality, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical ability, socioeconomic status. As followers of Christ, we are not tasked with determining who gets to enjoy the sweet fruits of faith. Our job is to welcome. So we should welcome like Christ welcomes the child, like Christ welcomes the Samaritan, the thief on the cross, the leper, the lame, the tax collector, the refugee, the widow, like Christ welcomes you and like Christ welcomes me. If we carefully look at the ministry of Christ, we can see all of the ways that Christ challenges these barriers and breaks them down in his community so that all may receive the wonderful gift of Christ. The good news that we get to consider in the church is realizing that this table is truly open to all in need of Christ's love and grace, which is in fact everyone. That there is no work to be done to receive these gifts. However, there is work to be done. This is the work of welcome and inclusion. We should be asking ourselves, how do we remove as many barriers as we possibly can so that all may be included here? How do we make our walls more permeable so that all in need of love and grace may easily pass through into the church? There are many things that can help with the awkwardness of being new in a community. How the seats are arranged, what the programs are like, if the person who brought you to church actually stays with you the entire time, or if you in fact notice that somebody is new, that you go and introduce yourselves. Now, if there is anybody new here, I don't want everybody to come and welcome them because that could be a little overwhelming. But intentionally creating an environment of welcome where as many obstacles as possible so that our neighbors may come and join this community, it's good work to try to get rid of or diminish those barriers as much as possible. And the thing is, this is not work to complete. This is work to perpetually practice. So when we participate in communion, we are reminded that this table is not the church's table, but it's God's table, and that all are welcome. That we are all made in the image of God, and that the divine dwells in each and every one of us. And if we believe that to be true, then the more people that we have around the table, the closer we get to see who God is like. And it's not that we can fully understand all of what God is like, but we should have a longing and a desire to know more of God and all of the goodness that comes with knowing God. So to bring this to an end, I've got two brief stories on when I saw a Christ-centered community create space, and there was a beautiful moment. So the first story is called the Yummy Story. So this took place at the camp that I described earlier, and it was during middle school week when we had about 30 or 40 tweens. And those tweens were trying to balance being goofy and cool all at the same time. It's pretty interesting to be a part of. So there was a camper who was at registration who was a 12-year-old boy, and he towered above everybody else. And at registration, he had this giant smile on his face. But when I greeted him, he just told me his name. I quickly found out from his mom that he was on the autism spectrum, and that he was verbal but would only answer with a couple words. And at that, with enthusiasm and exuberance, he yelled, "Yummy!" The mom then explained that this is one of his tics, that this is something that he does when he gets excited or just to engage. So at first during the week, during our normal camp programming, every once in a while he would yell "yummy" during swimming, during songs, during mealtime. It didn't really matter when. And everybody would practice tolerance, and they would just keep going on, and life was good and joyful. But I remember that there was that moment when tolerance turned into affirmation and acceptance. So it was during song time, and there was a counselor who was leading songs, And he made the decision that instead of following the tune or the words, that when this larger-than-life camper would yell yummy, the song leader would stop and yell yummy back. So in the middle of the song Deep and Wide, during the quiet part, this camper yelled yummy, and in response, the song leader yelled yummy just as enthusiastically back, and you could see this camper feel seen, feel heard, and know that he was a part of the community. So then the next time the camper yelled yummy, the entire camp yelled it. I don't think that we've even finished this song, because there really wasn't a need to, because we were all connected on a whole new level. We got to be a part of a beautiful, divine creation in that community. So the next story happened at a children's choir performance. And there was this kindergartner named Elijah. And Elijah never stopped moving. He was always crawling over the pews. He was always running up and down, jumping up and down. And it didn't seem like he liked to sing very much. So it was all that I could do to attend to him and make it so the others could practice their music. So the Sunday came when the choir was going to perform, and Elijah was front and center. And I realized at that moment what Elijah, I think, was trying to tell me, that Elijah was not going to sing. So I went up to Elijah, and I said, Elijah, do you want to dance? And he shook his head down, or up and down, and he was super enthusiastic about that possibility. So I said, you've got this little space. You can dance when everybody else sings. And once again, this is 5 minutes before the whole group is going to sing in front of the church. So I don't remember what the song was. I don't remember too much about that day, other than when the song started, Elijah began to break dance. He began to twirl and spin, and he loved it. And he was fully engaged. He stayed in his little spot, but he got to do what he wanted to do. And then the kids' choir behind him saw that, they laughed, thought it was great, and I really think they sounded better because of it. Then the entire congregation saw that this was different. I mean, this is not what normally happens on a Sunday morning, and they thought it was great too. So it just created this amazing moment where joy filled the room, allowing Elijah to be Elijah, and to give him the space and permission to do what he was made to do was a blessing for all that day. So on this Inclusion Sunday, I want to encourage everyone to continue not just to tolerate, but to embrace all God's children and give them the space to be the divine creations that they are. To not try to make them conform or to be the gatekeepers of who gets to be close to the divine, but rather see the divine value in each and every person and give that light a chance to shine for all to see. So to end this sermon, I'm going to quote one of the most famous Presbyterians, and I might be a little biased. So Mr. Rogers says, "You've made this day a special day by your just being you. There's no person in the world like you, and I like you just the way you are." Amen.